In an instant, hundreds of people were struck down as they ran for their lives, terrified of something so huge, so bizarre, so deadly, and yet in contrast, so incredibly sweet. It not only left a huge traumatic scar on the minds of the population, but a sickly sweet stain on its city walls. Hey guys, welcome to Bent Planet, where I tell you true stories of humans in abnormal predicaments. Tales that will twist your mind. And this story is no exception. If you do like hearing true stories of people in crazy situations, please like and subscribe so I can keep telling you awesome stories. Alright, get comfortable. You ready to hear a story? On January 15th, 1919, the people of North Boston were relieved to feel unexpected warm weather in the middle of winter. Heavily populated with hard-working immigrants, they were more than used to battling through harsh conditions. World War I had just ended, and along with its brutality, the Spanish flu had raged through over the previous year, taking a huge amount of lives with it. So the sun brought an air of hope for the future, but nobody was prepared for what was about to take place. Wanting to be home for lunch, 8-year-old Antonio D'Estasio left school early with his older sister Maria, joined by their friend Pascal. They decided to collect firewood on the way home, something they did regularly, but their motives weren't entirely selfless. The area where the kids would find loose scraps of wood was by a huge storage facility for molasses that took up space by the harbour. Molasses is a thick, dark brown syrup created by refining raw sugar, often used as a sweetener for cooking. Australians know it as golden syrup, and those in the UK call it treacle. And Antonio, Maria and Pascal knew where they could get some of this super sweet treat for free. The storage facility not only had wooden barrels full of it, where the old empty broken ones provided perfect scraps for firewood, but there was an absolutely enormous tank that stood dominating the skyline, built specifically for holding molasses. Towering almost 5 stories high and 90 feet or 27 meters in diameter, the tank held up to 2.5 million gallons of molasses. That's 9.5 million liters. And as fortune would have it for these kids, it was bursting with cracks, causing sweet flavored goo to leak from its metal seams. For the local kids, this was like a candy store handing out free lollies every day. And sneaking up to the tank to avoid being seen by the workers, they would fill cups or rub sticks along the sides of the tank to gather up the syrup and make amateur lollipops. Pascal's house was so close by that his father Giuseppe watched the kids through the window, laughing as they snuck around thinking they were unnoticed. By 12 o'clock, the workers at the facility were all relaxing and too lazy to chase the kids off, sharing stories over lunch as the city slowed down for their midday meal. Just a stone's throw away stood a fire station where the firemen relaxed with no emergency in sight, and the surrounding streets were filled with work trucks, horses and carts, many at a standstill while men took a breather, unwrapping their lunches that they'd packed that morning. Not wanting to be late for lunch at home, the kids quickly scraped molasses from the tank wall, gobbling it down before grabbing whatever wood they could and then turning to leave. But just as they turned to go their separate ways, an almighty sound cracked through the air. Rat-tat-tat-tat-tat-tat-tat! What sounded like gunfire hit their ears, sending a wave of confused shock that had everyone in the area stop and pay attention. But there was barely a moment for the kids to even turn around and see what was causing the noise before another deep screeching roar of tearing metal cut through them. Giuseppe looked forward to asking Pascal about his day at school, but just as he watched him turn to face the house, everything changed. As though the world hit slow motion, his ears were struck by the incredible sound of metallic thunder as his eyes witnessed the worst thing imaginable. The giant tank, casting its monstrous shadow over the children, swelled outward in an instant, and as huge industrial screws burst from their rivets, the ginormous sheets of metal that encased the liquid inside exploded, sending a 40-foot tidal wave of sickly sweet death out in every direction. Giuseppe barely had time to take in the shock of what he was seeing, his son disappearing below a dark, expanding ocean before he felt the whole house shake and shatter as it too was engulfed by the expanding wall of brown sludge. This is a surfer riding a 40-foot wave. Now imagine the weight of this if it was warm syrup hitting you unexpectedly against a hard city pavement with unbelievable force. Little Antonio's body was slammed against the ground and then picked up with incredible speed by the sugary ocean, tumbling and spinning in every direction as he desperately grappled to reach oxygen, his nose, mouth, ears and eyes filling with thick syrup. In a 360-degree radius, the wave hurled outward at 35 miles per hour. The men at the fire station only knew what hit them after the walls had crumbled like cardboard, sending furniture, debris and tools flying, knocking their bodies to pieces as they struggled to stay afloat in the swirling mess. One of the men, George Leahy, was in the basement at the foot of the fire pole when he became pinned to the floor, a pool table and a piano both thrown on top of him in the surge of syrup. Unable to move the weight of the objects due to their own injuries, the other men watched helplessly as the molasses rose over George's mouth and nose, filling his screaming lungs and smothering the life from his body. Outside was pure carnage. Rows of horses tied up on the street were spun like toys and smothered by the sticky deluge, tangled in their ropes and unable to clamber up to oxygen. Blacksmiths, wagon drivers, delivery men, children walking with their parents, scores of people on the streets were engulfed by the ferocious black tsunami as it knocked them off their feet, beating their bodies with metal, wood and other debris until they were either dead or severely injured. Patrolman Frank McManus was on a payphone with the local police station when he heard the roaring sounds and saw a monstrous dark wall rushing towards him, destroying everything in its path. He managed to scream, "Send all available rescue vehicles! There's a wave of molasses coming down Commercial Street!" before running for his life in the opposite direction. A train conductor, Albert Lehman, was on the elevated passenger train platform that ran along Commercial Street, opposite where the tank stood. The explosion ripped nearby buildings from their foundations, throwing them into the train track support structures, twisting them like coat hangers and tearing the train track apart, sending train carriages plummeting to the street below. Lehman jumped down from his station on the platform and clambered across the twisted wreckage of tracks, running towards the next oncoming train, signalling it to stop just in time before it took a dive through the freshly shredded steel. Isaac Yeton was working outside a shed when he heard the chaos unfolding. Turning, he saw a railway car hurtling towards him. He ran toward the harbour only to be swept up by the wave and slammed into a building doorway when a foreman above spotted him, stuck there and threw down a ladder. Isaac managed to pull himself to safety, injured but alive. One of the buildings that severed the support beams of the train line was the 3-story home of Bridget Cloherty. The 65-year-old was crushed as her entire house was ripped into pieces. On the top floor, her son Martin was fast asleep after working a night shift at a local bar. He woke up thinking he'd been thrown overboard on a ship, the molasses breaking down one wall and pushing him out through the other. As he struggled to remain afloat, he managed to grab hold of his bed, pulling himself up onto it as it shot out onto the street like a surfboard. Within the swirling chaos, he managed to spot his sister and rescued her by dragging her up onto the bed with him, bringing life back into her body by sucking the molasses out of her nostrils so she could manage to breathe. Meanwhile, little Antonio had managed to grab hold of a plank of wood to pull his head up for air, but he was swept out of control and thrown headfirst into the pole of a streetlight. A man spotted his body soon after and pushed through the filthy muck to save him, but when he found his limp body coated in sticky film, he carried it to an area where others were already lining up the dead. As the wave continued to spread out, its height dropped, and with the devastation left in its path, it was reduced to a stagnant swamp that rescuers were forced to wade through as they searched for survivors. Locals ran to the area where bodies were being lined up to search for their loved ones, including Antonio and Maria's mother, who screamed out desperately for her children. As her eyes searched the rows of corpses, one small body lifted an arm toward her. It was Antonio. He had gained consciousness again and heard her calls, but with a throat full of sludge, he couldn't respond. Giuseppe also searched frantically for Pascal as firemen, police, Red Cross personnel and locals all did their best to move wreckage and debris. But as day turned into night and the temperatures dropped, the molasses began to solidify like quicksand, impossible to push through and firmly trapping anyone who was still caught in its grip. Hour by hour, more bodies were discovered, including little Maria, who had not survived the initial surge of the molasses wave, and Pascal, who was found 5 days later, his body broken under the weight of a railroad car that had toppled from the overhead lines. As newspaper headlines swarmed the shelves, the death toll continued to rise, some bodies being found months later in the harbour nearby. Eventually, the total loss of human life came to 21, while around 150 people were injured and up to 25 horses were killed. The company that owned the molasses tank, the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, or USIA, claimed that the explosion was due to a terrorist attack and that anarchists had planted a bomb. This, they said, made them void of responsibility. Ironically, the molasses was actually being stored to sell to companies that made bombs. Molasses could be heated and distilled to make industrial alcohol, which had become a key ingredient in the explosives used against the Germans in the war. The company refused to help with the cleanup effort or play any role in looking after those it had affected, as the poor and powerless residents of North Boston spent months cleaning up and rebuilding. A lawsuit ensued, and after a 5-year battle with thousands of witnesses, police investigations found no proof of an explosive device, but an incredible amount of evidence to show that the tank itself had been structurally unfit to hold the weight of the molasses, and it was an accountant, not an engineer, that had overseen its construction. One worker at the storage plant had continually attempted to warn his supervisors of the impending doom, but his cries fell on deaf ears. In fact, the only response made was to have the tank painted the same colour as the molasses, so that the areas with syrup leaking through the cracks would be less noticeable. In the end, USIA was ordered to pay the flood victims and their family members $628,000 in damages, the equivalent of around $8 million today. This was one of the first cases of a large company being held accountable for such a tragedy and forced major regulation changes to construction across the USA. Of course, by this time, the damage had already been done to North Boston, and despite the many months it took to scrape the sticky disaster's evidence from the streets, the houses and the basements of the city, the sickly sweet smell of molasses remained for many, many years, swelling up on hot days like an invisible fog, to remind people of that tragic moment in 1919 when a dark tide engulfed their lives. Alright guys, that's going to do it for today's story. If you enjoyed it, please hit that like and subscribe so I can keep telling you more incredible true stories of humans in abnormal predicaments. Alright, stay safe out there, and most importantly, stay bent.